Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and I'm starting the new year with a Christmas dress. Okay, so technically I made this dress in November, but it was a gift, so I had to schedule this video for after the holidays. So my grandmother asked me to make dresses for my two nieces that she could give them for Christmas, and she had talked to one of my nieces and she specifically requested a long fancy dress. So I started out by deciding on my pattern, and I chose the Catrine pattern by Violette Field Threads. And specifically, I was really inspired by this model garment from their website. After choosing the pattern, I moved on to picking my fabrics. And I started by looking for the fabric for the bodice because I knew that was going to be like the statement part of this dress, and everything else was going to be solids and could easily just work around whatever color I picked. So I ended up picking this red and gold lace from Fabric Wholesale Direct, which looked even better in person, so much so that I really kind of just wanted to keep it. But I did resist. Then for the skirt and the sleeves, I chose a matching red voile. And for the lining, I used cotton polyester broadcloth. I had thought about doing a satin because I feel like that's what usually you think of for both fancy dresses, and even linings usually have that silkier feel to them. However, since it's going to be under all of the lace and the sheer voile, I decided that that wasn't really necessary because it's not going to be seen, and it really saved me the headache of working with such a slippery fabric. So I started by cutting out the bodice pieces. I needed 2 of the front bodice and 4 of the back. I then set half of each of those pieces aside for the lining, and took the other half and placed them on the wrong side of the lace and basted them together before cutting them out. This is called flatlining, and from this point forward, these 2 layers will be treated as one and considered the main bodice. Now, up to this point, I have been a little concerned about the color of my fabrics because the lace was darker than the sheer voile and the lining fabrics. The sequins on the lace matched really well, but not so much the rest of it. However, I found that once it was flatlined to the lining, it kind of lightened the color a little so that it matched much better. Next, I stitched the back bodice pieces to the front bodice along the side seams, and did that for both the main fabric and the lining fabric. And this really must be a fancy dress because I even changed my machine threads to red instead of white, even though these seams won't be seen. Next is the sleeves. This dress has off-shoulder sleeves plus straps, which I really liked, and it's actually a part of why I picked this pattern, because I like the look of the off-shoulder sleeves, but because it has straps, I don't have to worry as much about how good the fit is, which is helpful since it's not like I could have my niece try this on. So I used the sheer voile for the sleeves. I had to cut out 4 of them and then place 2 of them together and sew along both of the long edges. Then flipped them right side out and gathered the shorter edges. And I chose to hand gather because sometimes with this type of fabric, because it's so thin and slippery, it just ends up getting more eat up by the machine than gathered like I want it. For the straps, I cut out 2 from my lining fabric, then flatlined them to the wall, then folded and pressed them in half before folding in those raw edges and pressing them again. And then I just did a top stitch straight down the middle of those pieces. So assembling the bodice can be a little tricky and hard to explain because of the shape. And so it has to be sewn in sections. It starts by pinning a strap to the top edge of one of the back bodices of the main bodice. And then you want to space it 1/2 inch away from the armhole and pin in place. Then pin a sleeve to the same back armhole spaced 1/2 inch from the top edge. Then layer the lining on top with the right sides together and sew from that center back across the top and down under the armhole to that first side seam. That's where you stop. Then take everything off the machine, pull the strap and sleeve under the armhole and around to the front bodice where you pin it in place the same as you did for the back bodice. This is where it looks kind of funky because in order for the front to lay flat enough to be sewn, the back has to be kind of all scrunched up. And while I was doing this, I also pinned the remaining sleeve and strap to the other side of the front bodice. I then put the lining back over top and sewed from that first side seam where I stopped last across the front and over to the other side seam. Then had to take everything off the machine again, pull the second strap and sleeve from the front to the back and pin it in place before sewing again from that last side seam around to the center back. After everything was sewn and I had checked to make sure that I hadn't caught or twisted any of those straps or sleeve pieces, I clipped the curves and the corners before flipping it right side out and pressed it, making sure to have the lining facing up. And for once, I did understitch this. That's when you stitch the seam allowance to the lining in this case, or the facing. It's supposed to keep the lining or facing from rolling to like the outside of the bodice. I usually skip this because it often ends up being more trouble than it's worth for me, because inevitably something gets caught in the stitches and I have to rip it out. But again, this is a fancy dress, so I just did it very slowly and carefully. And finally, I basted the remaining raw edges together. And with that, the bodice is done. Now for the skirt. Before I started this, I did take my niece's measurements without telling her what I was doing. And when I did that, I measured for a floor-length skirt, which for her, according to the measurements I was getting, was slightly longer than a yard. However, I wasn't going to buy 2 yards of fabric just for the extra couple of inches that I needed. So instead, I had planned on buying a yard of fabric, evening out the edges, and just making it a little shorter than floor length, because after all, long doesn't necessarily have to mean floor length. However, the fabric I got actually was a bit longer than a yard, so I was able to make it slightly longer, but I did not go for the full length that I was measuring, because after I took those measurements and ordered the fabric, it dawned on me that the measurement I got was actually a few inches longer than what my own full-length skirt measurement is. And my niece is not taller than me yet. She's close, but she's not there yet. So I kind of feel like maybe my measurements were a little off, so I ended up actually just cutting it to the same length that I would if I was making a floor-length skirt for myself. So anyway, I cut the voile to the measurement that I had settled on, then trimmed the sides so that I could remove that selvage edge, as well as straighten up the edge that I had already cut on when I cut out the sleeves. This fabric was extra wide, so even with removing the sleeves, it was still really wide and plenty wide enough that I just used the full width for the skirt. I used a rolled hem on my serger to finish the skirt hem. And for this, I did leave the thread white because sergers have to have 4 separate spools of thread. And not only do I almost never change the thread on my serger, but I usually don't have 4 spools of one color. Typically, this isn't a problem because a lot of times if I'm doing a rolled hem, it's on a very light colored fabric and I can get away with using white thread. However, in this case, I knew that the white was going to be a little too visible. So what I did was, after I serged it, I just took some 1/4 inch red ribbon and sewed that right on top to hide those threads. Then I gathered the voile and basted it to the bodice. So obviously this skirt does need a lining. For that, I used the broadcloth and cut 2 panels that were 36 inches long by the full width of the fabric. I then took one of those panels and cut it in half to make 2 panels for the back. I then sewed the back pieces to the front piece along the side seams. I made sure to use the selvage edge on all of the pieces for these seams. That way they didn't have to be finished. While the skirt was flat, I did also run it through the serger to finish off the hem so that it would be ready for toning up later. I then gathered this skirt lining and layered it on top of the sheer voile over the bodice, and then sewed both skirt pieces to the bodice with a more permanent stitch than the basting stitch that I used earlier on the voile skirt. Now I'm just serging that center back seam starting at the top of the bodice and going down into the 2 layers of the skirt, but only as far down as the zipper is going to go. Then I attached the zipper, and I did go back later and tack down that piece that sticks up over the edge. Then I realized at this point that the sequins on the back bodice were interfering with the zipper. I had actually thought about that before I sewed the zipper on, but did not take care of it, and therefore making a bigger problem for me later. So I had to go back and kind of try and clip off those sequins that were really close to the zipper. Unfortunately, since half of them were also caught in the seam where the zipper was sewn, it was hard to get but so close without risking cutting into the fabric. And because of that, this helped some, but not quite enough. So then I ended up pressing the zipper really well and having to top stitch around the zipper so that it laid a little better, and that seems like maybe it's fixed the problem. So now I need to close that back skirt seam. So I start with the skirt inside out and the right sides of the fabric together, and I stitched about the first inch or so of that seam through both of the skirt layers. Then I switched to sewing the layers separately. So for the voile layer, I did a French seam. That starts by sewing the seam with the wrong sides together, then trimming the seam allowance down, and then sewing the seam again, this time with the right sides together and making sure it's wide enough to encase the raw edge. The lining was a lot simpler. That was just sewn right sides together and then serged. And the last step was turning up the lining hem twice and sewing it in place. I am so happy with how this dress turned out. I definitely think I nailed the criteria of long and fancy, and I had a lot of fun with it because this is the kind of dress that I like to make, but I don't wear fancy dresses like that, so it's fun to have an excuse to make one for my niece. And so far, everybody I've shown it to has really liked it, and hopefully she will as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.